I want to begin with three figures, three cold, hard numbers that should send a chill down the spine of anyone paying close attention to how the world actually functions beneath the surface rhetoric. 12 commercial ships seized in a single coordinated sweep. 40 Russian naval units operating simultaneously across 3 distinct maritime theaters. And, more than $3 billion in commercial assets now locked inside Russian custody. Washington is furious. Emergency meetings have been convened, condemnations issued, and warnings delivered. But beneath the outrage lies an uncomfortable truth that almost no one in power is willing to say out loud. This was not an emotional outburst. This was not a reckless escalation. And it was certainly not improvised. It was calculated. And honestly, the most unsettling part of all is this. We showed them how to do it. To understand what just happened, we have to strip away the talking points and look directly at the reality unfolding in the waters bordering Russia. In a maneuver executed with unmistakable military discipline, Russian forces carried out near-simultaneous seizures of LNG carriers and oil tankers across the Black Sea, the Baltic approaches, and the Arctic shipping lanes. These were American-operated vessels and Allied-flagged ships, detained not through overt acts of war, but under layers of legal justification so intricate that Western legal teams are still parsing the fine print. This distinction matters because the response from Western leaders followed the familiar script: public shock, urgent summits, and threats of consequences. Yet having observed foreign policy long enough to recognize genuine surprise, I can say this plainly: their astonishment was real. And that is far more troubling than the seizures themselves. It reveals a catastrophic failure of strategic imagination, a move that should have been anticipated, because it was modeled directly on Western behavior, was instead treated as unthinkable. To grasp why this matters, I need to challenge a belief most people hold without ever questioning it: the idea that international maritime law exists as a protective shield for commercial shipping. On paper, those treaties are extensive and detailed. In theory, merchant vessels operate in a neutral space, insulated from great power conflict. But treaties do not enforce themselves. Rules only function when there is a neutral power willing and able to uphold them. When enforcement mechanisms themselves are weaponized, law does not disappear. It mutates. And when that happens, legality becomes a tool of coercion rather than protection. To see how we arrived here, we have to rewind to late 2022. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the West unveiled what it proudly described as the most aggressive sanctions regime in modern history. Russian banks were cut off from international systems, foreign assets were frozen, and most critically, a global oil price cap was imposed. The stated goal was elegant in theory: keep Russian oil flowing to prevent global shortages, but cap the revenue so Moscow's war effort would slowly be starved of funds. In Washington, this was framed as a precise, technocratic solution, a calibrated economic strike. But Moscow did not experience it that way. From the Russian perspective, the message was unmistakable. The West had unilaterally declared control over the global energy trade. Russia was told it could sell its own resources, but only at prices dictated by its geopolitical adversaries. And this ultimatum was enforced not through diplomacy, but through Western dominance of shipping insurance, port access, and financial clearing systems. The message was simple and brutal: comply or your ships don't move. For nearly 2 years, Russia absorbed the damage while quietly building an alternative system. Exports were redirected toward Asia-Arctic shipping routes, long dismissed by Western analysts as impractical, were rapidly expanded. New financial channels emerged to bypass Western banks entirely. These were not improvisations, they were preparations. Russia was not just surviving sanctions, it was preparing for a world in which it no longer required Western permission to function. By late 2024, the dynamic shifted from preparation to confrontation. The United States and its allies began physically boarding and inspecting tankers in international waters, suspecting them of bypassing the oil price cap. The justification was sanctions enforcement. The reality was something far more significant. Economic policy had crossed the threshold into physical coercion. Moscow watched closely. It documented every boarding, every inspection, every instance in which Western power asserted authority over supposedly neutral commerce. Then came the catalyst. In mid-December, an American-operated tanker collided with a Russian research vessel in northern waters, killing several Russian sailors. Washington described the incident as a tragic accident. Moscow claimed the tanker was conducting surveillance and demanded it return for a criminal investigation. When the ship refused, Russia labeled the crew fugitives. Which version is true almost doesn't matter. What matters is what Russia did next. By framing the incident as a criminal matter rather than a military one, Moscow constructed a legal architecture that justified enforcement actions without crossing the formal threshold of war. This distinction allowed Russia to present its response as law enforcement rather than aggression. The seizures that followed were not chaotic. They were synchronized. Naval units moved in concert across multiple maritime zones, boarding and escorting 12 vessels into Russian ports. Hundreds of ordinary commercial sailors saw their legal status transformed overnight. They were no longer crew members. They were now material witnesses in an ongoing investigation. They are not officially hostages, but functionally, they have become leverage in a geopolitical confrontation they played no role in creating. What Russia has done here is shatter one of the foundational assumptions of modern global trade, that commercial shipping operates in a neutral space, insulated from strategic conflict. By deliberately applying the same logic the West used, legal frameworks backed by coercive force, Moscow has turned the system back on its creators. The reasoning is devastatingly straightforward. If the United States can board tankers in open waters to enforce sanctions, why can't Russia board vessels to enforce security claims? If Western financial and legal systems can be weaponized to control prices, why can't regional military power be weaponized to control access? This is not escalation. It is mirroring, and it exposes a question Western policymakers never wanted to confront. Can you dictate global rules without becoming vulnerable to their inversion? The human cost is already mounting. Families thousands of miles away have had their lives abruptly disrupted. Sailors who signed on for commercial voyages now find themselves entangled in geopolitical theater. When commerce becomes a battlefield, it is always ordinary people who pay first. But the deeper danger lies ahead. If this precedent holds, maritime shipping enters a profoundly unstable era. Environmental regulations, security laws, and surveillance accusations are broad enough to justify almost any stop and search. The line between enforcement and economic hostage-taking is dissolving. Every vessel becomes suspect. Every route becomes contingent. And Russia is not the only observer. China is watching. Iran is watching. Others are learning the lesson in real time. Insurance rates near Russian-controlled waters have already surged, rendering some routes commercially unviable. Supply chains are beginning to fracture as companies struggle to price in geopolitical risk. For nations dependent on uninterrupted logistics, this is not an inconvenience. It is a strategic nightmare. The deepest irony is this. The sanctions meant to isolate Russia have instead enabled it to demonstrate a different form of power. Not financial dominance, not institutional leadership, but the power to inject uncertainty, disrupt norms, and impose chaos on systems designed for stability. This is desperation masquerading as strategy, but that makes it more dangerous, not less. Russia understands it cannot win by Western rules, so it is attempting to rewrite them. What should alarm us most is not Russia's behavior, but our failure to anticipate it. We convinced ourselves we could inflict economic pain indefinitely without facing physical consequences. That was never strategy. It was wishful thinking. Now we stand at a crossroads. Either clear boundaries are renegotiated or asset seizures become normalized. The 12 ships currently sitting in Russian ports are not isolated incidents. They are markers, signals of a transformation that will reshape global trade for years to come. They prove that the stability we assumed was permanent was, in fact, fragile all along. Stay attentive, stay engaged, because the question of whether ships sail freely or sit idle in foreign harbors will define the next chapter of global power far more than any speech or summit ever could.